Resume recording, and
Well,
I'm gonna find our chat
you want
here.
it this early?
Well, no, I don't, but I have no choice. Um, anyhow, yeah, I didn't get a chance to check in to see how many more people are going to come. One person I know who was going to come, um, just emailed me and said she can't make it, but wondered if we were recording it. So we will record it.
Okay.
And actually, I
Yeah.
don't need to be recording this, so let me pause recording. To her apartment, demanding $10,000 because her grandson was involved in an accident, which of course none of that is true. Um, Happy Wednesday, everyone. So it's good to see folks logging on. We're going to wait a few more minutes for folks to show up. Just a reminder, we're recording this. You are welcome to be anonymous if you wish. We have a Q&A. I have the panel open in case anyone has questions. Keith and I will do our best to try to keep up with them. This should be a lively a lively seminar. So I'm glad everybody's showing up. We're going to wait a few more minutes as our friends log in, and hopefully I won't get any more emergency phone calls from, oh my gosh, crazy, crazy, crazy. All righty. Wait a few more minutes, see who else is showing. I know a lot of people it's taken a lot of spoons just to show up to things like this right now with what's going on in the world. So I appreciate you for being here today.
We're all like the Marines, the few, the proud.
That's right. That's right. We're the Marines of the world right now. Well, let's
Yes.
get started. People will trickle in as they do. First off, thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. Today's topic, kind of a hot topic with what's going on in the world, is disclosing in the workplace the if, how, when, and what. And this is a conversation that I know I've had with many people over the last 18 years. Keith, I know, has had the same conversation. And, we also sometimes have to wonder ourselves, what do we disclose in the workplace? What's safe, right? So it's a topic for all of us. And just to remind you, I do have the Q&A open. So if you have questions, feel free to write them down here and we will get to them. And maybe we'll even be able to move through. There we go. So EvoLibri, most of you, if not all of you, know who we are. So we are a small fee-for-service agency located here in Santa Clara County in Santa Clara, and we provide services for neurodivergent folks who might need a little help throughout their lives navigating the neurotypical world. We also work with employers and with families and schools and pretty much anybody who has a need. Who am I? I'm Jan Johnston-Tyler, and I am the founder and CEO of EvoLibri Consulting. Again, this is our 18th year doing this work. I left a high-tech job back in, oh God, 25 years ago now. Changed my career, went back to school, got my master's degree. Why? Because I first off wanted to do something more meaningful with my life, but also because I had a kiddo who was autistic and I could see that he needed some help. And he wasn't alone. There were a lot of other people. So I decided to start EvoLibri to meet those needs. And we have Keith. Keith, introduce yourself.
Okay. I'm not Sam Johnston-Tyler. I'm Keith Halperin, and I've been working with Evo Libre for, oh my gosh, about 10, 11 months now. My background, I came out of a 30 plus year recruiting career in which I dealt with a number of neurodiverse individuals. I also have a son who is on the spectrum, and as I learn more about him, I realize, hey, maybe that's me too. So I tell people now, since I've not been formally diagnosed, if I'm not on the spectrum, I'm damn close to it. Things like
That's
that.
right.
And
Spectrum adjacent.
yes, yes, maybe I'm a spectrum ally. Who knows? But anyway, going forward with our particular program today, folks, spoiler alert, and disclose. How about that? Not here, that wasn't necessary, but another place it did. Anyway, Jan, back to you.
Excellent, thank you. So our topics for today, roughly, are if you should disclose. That's sort of one of the basic questions because not every situation requires that you disclose, right? And we're going to talk about the benefits and possible challenges about disclosure. We're also going to talk about some misconceptions about disclosure, and specifically what I mean by that is what I call the soft versus hard disclosure. So there are ways to disclose without being formal about it, where you can simply ask for certain things or disclose, yeah, I'm kind of forgetful sometimes or whatever, versus a formal disclosure where you need to have certain pieces of information in place and you're asking for specific accommodations or help along the way. So that's, we're going to talk about that. Then when to disclose. This is another hot topic. And again, it can vary from disclosing before an interview, during an interview, after hire, or at the time of need, which might be years later, right? So it really kind of depends, but we're going to talk about that. And then how to disclose. How do you actually approach somebody and disclose to them? And finally, what to disclose. What should you tell people that gives them enough information to get what you need, but doesn't necessarily leave you open for any negative response? And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So, Keith, you want to take the first one on? Should you disclose?
I guess so. Anyway, thank you. Should we disclose? Folks, one of the things that I want to give you sort of a major heads up on this particular aspect of it, as well as pretty much all the topics that we're going to say, is that there are, to the best of my understanding, and perhaps I can speak for Jan as well, there are no clear yes or no, do this, don't do this. It's always or never types of things. It's very situation dependent, and often that makes it quite difficult for us to gauge whether the situation. So some of the things you could find out based on that is, does it seem that your organization provides support to disabled people? Uh, what type of overall corporate culture is there? Does there seem to be a lot of activity regarding support for people with disabilities or not? Does it seem to be pro-DEI? Does it seem to be neutral? Does it seem to be not? And again, you're not likely to come up with an answer on this immediately, and it may not come up at all. This is some of the stuff that might be very useful for you to figure out. One of the things that would indicate that there's probably a fairly strong presence there is, are there advocacy, employee groups toward this disabled community, either specific ones or general ones, things like that. And then beyond that, perhaps in the most personal level, does this seem like a safe and comfortable environment for you as a disabled person? Do you feel that you would be supported? Do you not? And that's a very individual decision. So another thing is, like, decide about how you would go about this. What kind of needs would you have, do you have, that could be accommodated? And as we have here, there is a very, very useful website called askjan.org. No connection, which surprised me. I thought for a long time, our
That's
fearless
not
leader
me.
here.
This
No,
stole
it's
my name.
not. It's not. Yes, yeah. Um, A very helpful website to help determine this. Um, then, as Jen alluded to earlier, do you have the emotional spoons to be vulnerable in this way? Are you able to do this? Either you feel that you've got the support externally, internally, or both, but that's the important thing. So it can often be a very complicated decision, but it is a very important one, and it is one that you can make. So,
Absolutely.
Jen, back to you.
Thank you. And just to follow up, this is the kind of thing that a trusted friend to sit down and speak with somebody, it might be a mentor at work, but it could just be a friend or a parent and say, here's the situation. Here's what I've learned about the organization. Here's what I think I need. What do you think? And just to have somebody to talk it out with, I think is useful before you make the decision. So hopefully you have
Yes.
somebody who can support you. So then the next, and my apologies, I've got way too many windows. So misconceptions about disclosure. So as I intimated earlier, there's a sort of a concept that it has to be a formal disclosure, right? That you have to have your paperwork, that you have to go march into HR and you need to do all this. And that is definitely one way. And it may be the correct way, depending on the situation. But disclosure can be a simple negotiation with your manager or with your coworkers. It does not necessarily mean you have to file formal paperwork. So one thing that we like to talk about is, again, soft disclosure and soft request for accommodation, which can be something as simple as, I really struggle with listening and kind of getting what people are saying to me orally. Is there any way, I can either take notes or you can send this to me in email, right? That's a way of asking for an accommodation without really saying anything except this is how I work best, right?
Yep.
And in an ideal work environment, that would be accepted. Oh, sure, no problem. And fun fact, when we manage up that way, typically what happens is if it serves you well, it's going to serve other people in the department well, right? So this is why I love most accommodation requests is because if we're asking for one person and if it's decided that that's a good accommodation and if it changes the culture so that becomes the norm, it serves everyone, neurodivergent and neurotypical people. So again, it doesn't have to be a formal disclosure and request for accommodations. It really depends. Another misconception is that it will make things worse. Now, if you asked me this 6 months ago, I'd say no. If you ask me today, I just kind of don't know what to tell you. So it is true that disclosing sometimes can lead to discrimination, but it also gives you protection under ADA. So, on par, again, 6 months ago, if you really needed accommodations and if you're really struggling in the world or the workplace, I would say, yes, you should go ahead and do it. Now I might be a little bit more cautious, only because I really don't know what's going to happen with ADA. As you well know, a certain president is, or not president, but 17 states, I guess, are trying to sue the federal government to eradicate 504 protections. And for those of you who don't know, we're going to talk about it next month more in detail. ADA and 504 are kind of cut from the same cloth. 504 is for students, ADA is for people who are not students. So will it make things worse? It kind of depends. I'm hopeful that most companies understand that it is the law of the land, number one, and number two, it's the right thing to do. So I'm hopeful it will not make things worse. The last is, will it hinder my career? Now, again, I have to be honest here. As some of you know, we've been working in the neurodivergency in the workspace space for about 12 years now. And outside of one person that we have worked with, one autistic person who we've helped in this way, nobody's been promoted. And I don't know if it's because they came in through some of these programs or if people just felt that, hey, they have a job and they do a good job and that's fine and that's all they could do, or if it was just dumb luck that these people never went up for promotion. I don't know. Um, it's hard to say, is there discrimination here? Is it hindering people's careers? I have to say, I don't know, and it depends. And it's really difficult for me to say yes or no on that one. So I would say, like with any job, you know, hopefully your career progression depends more on your ability to do the job, get it done with the least amount of fuss and muss possible, right? And that's true in any job. But at the same time, I'm not going to tell you, no, 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 it will never hinder your career. People will, wrap their arms around you and promote you to the heavens for the work that you do. I don't know. So more on that, and I'm hopeful that that will change over time.
The thing to think about, Shannon, it just occurred to me. It'd be interesting to find, there may not be any statistics on it, but it'd be interesting to find out if across companies overall, there is a tendency for people with any type of disability who remain with the company to be not promoted.
That's that would be a wonderful piece of information to have. And I think about all the people that I've worked with. I know plenty of autistic people and ADHD people who were hired straight through the front door, meaning they were not part of a hiring program. And I would say, for the most part, most of those people have a traditional or regular career progression. They get promoted, they get raises, all of that. The people who come in or went in through neurodivergency hiring programs have a lower chance. I think because they're pigeonholed. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's like, oh, well, they're autistic. They were part of this special program. And so, just the fact that they have a job should be enough, which is BS, right? By the same token, I know that managers oftentimes did not work with those same people on their career development the way they might with a person who, again, walked through the front door, right? And so it's one of those things. If you don't have a manager who is consciously trying to develop you to the next level or doesn't want to have those conversations, and if the employee isn't asking those questions about career development, then you're going to flatline, right? You're going to stay in the same place. So everybody owns their own career development, and that's something that we always try to work with people on as well.
Yep.
Cool.
Good.
All righty.
Good.
When to disclose, Mr. Halperin?
Mhm. Disclose early, disclose often. No, that's another thing. Um, Again, there are a wide variety of times when you can do it, if you so decide that you should. So let's go through some of those. So you could do it before hire. Some people choose to do it as part of the interviewing process. This is useful if the interviewing process is difficult. Um, what I tell people and what I say is, in my own case, if you feel that you can come off in an interview with as basically a neurotypical person, that you don't have any, shall we say, quirks, which is sort of a dog whistle for, oh, they have autism, then I say you don't really need to disclose. On the other hand, if you genuinely say, there are things about me which are going to likely come up in an interview that may affect my performance there, then I think that's an appropriate way to do it. We'll go into more how to do it later on, but that's the sort of thing. In my own case, and I'm maybe doing it here, though it's a little bit awkward since it's via Zoom. When I get tense, I have a problem with the eye contact thing. So I might say, hey, folks, sometimes I don't get as much eye contact with others as they might feel comfortable with. Just letting you know how I am, and hope that's okay with you. And we'll get, as I say, we'll get into more of that sort of thing later on. Things like that. Other times, it's like no problem interviewing. or maybe you already did it in a subtle way, and the other people around are no longer around that you interviewed with. That you may come up with a work situation which is hindering you because of a lack of accommodation, uh, and then it would be very appropriate to do that. Curiously enough, often a lot of the things at this point are, as Jen was saying earlier on, could be very useful, not just to you, but to the entire community. Example of that is having something written down for you so you know exactly what you do. I had a situation where I was working with some neurotypical colleagues, and I wanted my boss to say, hey, look, I would really appreciate it so I can do exactly what you need me to do in the way you need it. Let me write it down, or please write it down for me. And they wouldn't do it. And my colleagues were frustrated as well. And they said, it would really be helpful if so and so wrote down what she wants us to do. So again, something that's good for us, an accommodation like this, could be good for everyone. And then finally, sometimes it happens when you're at a crisis at work. It looks like you may have been in jeopardy for your hire. Sometimes that's the appropriate time to do it. As someone who once did that, and again, that's my spoiler alert, says sometimes that's a bit too late. Things like that. So my suggestion is, unless things have gone smoothly in all ways beforehand, would not do this. And I would say prior to that, probably either before or after the hire, if you do need to disclose, it would be better to do that until when a crisis occurs. Any additional thoughts on that, Jim?
Yeah, I mean, and absolutely to all three of them, it depends. Before hire, the downside is there going to be bias, right? If I tell somebody that I have a condition, whatever that condition is that going to bias me against them hiring me, right? So it's a little six of one, half dozen the other on that one. Having said that, I know people who have disclosed soon after they were hired. And these were soft disclosures. These were not like, I need, this big list of accommodations.
Yeah.
Just simply telling the manager, and the manager came unglued. Why didn't you tell me that beforehand? Well, I didn't have to, number one. And I had to get involved because this is somebody who was working with us and to cool his jets, and just say, look, you didn't have the legal right. He can do the job. He can do the job well. He is just giving you the benefit of understanding him a little bit better by disclosing. But the manager was hot. So, it's like you're withholding information was his complaint. There was, no real legal leg to stand on. And would this person have been hired if he had disclosed prior? Probably not, based on the reaction of the manager, right? So, and the guy ended up working there for several years, so things calmed down. And then the last one, the downside is if you wait until you're in crisis, and this could be something like your job changes. It could be that you have a new manager who you don't work as well with, or has a different work style. To Keith's point, refuses to write things down, wants to come into the office and just bark orders and expect people to drop everything. If you wait until that moment to disclose, then it looks like a cop out to some people, right? It looks like, oh, you're just making excuses because I'm expecting you to work hard. So it can backfire. We like, if at all possible, people to do soft disclosures pretty soon after hire in an ideal world. And then as and if they need accommodations, to work with their manager or their supervisor and help them navigate, how would you like me going about this, right? But we're going to talk about that in a second. Good stuff, Keith. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
All righty. So how to disclose. And again, Keith and I were talking about this when we did our run through. There is no one set path, sadly, because it is so situationally dependent. And so again, I'd love to be able to give you a bullet list, do this, 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 but I can't. Anyhow, so how to disclose. If you are asking for formal accommodations, typically you will need a letter of accommodations from a healthcare provider. And depending on where you work and who you're working with, that healthcare provider could be your therapist. Some people complain about that and say, no, it's got to be a medical doctor. Here in the state of California, there's no hard and fast rule, but sometimes it's just easier to go to your medical doctor provider and ask them to write a letter of accommodation. But before you do that, you really need to understand what is it that you're asking for, because your medical doctor or your psychologist or even your therapist is not going to be well read on what accommodations are available and usually asked for. So it's going to be up to you, askjan.org, to go look, do the research, try to figure out where you're stuck. Look at the materials on askjan.org, which will give you a list by disability. So for example, if you have ADHD, they have a whole section on ADHD. You can go look at that and say, oh yeah, that would really help me if I had this accommodation. And then figure out how you're going to word it. So they have one for autism. They have it for, pretty much everything you can imagine. So I would spend some time doing your research about what accommodations are typically asked for, make up a bulleted list, and then talk to your doctor. So you might say, look, I'm really having a hard time focusing at work because I'm sitting right next to the bathroom and people are talking really loudly. I really need to have a quieter location to work. So your doctor then can write an accommodation request that says something to the effect of, due to Jerome's disability, he will perform better if he's in a quiet, distraction-free location. Simple, right? So that's the background. Now, the right person. Again, some companies will say, or some managers will say, tell me and we'll deal with it between the two of us. I don't want you going to HR because then it's a whole mess. Other companies or managers may not know what to do with an accommodation, so you will have to go to HR to ask for requests for accommodation. So I would spend some time on your intranet at your workplace looking around for, do they have an accessibility group? Do they have, disability? Do they have a link on their intranet of where and who you should speak to? If you can't find anybody, hopefully you have an HR representative. You can speak to them. If you don't know who your HR representative is, then you're back to asking your manager, saying, hey, I need to file for formal requests. Can you please let me know how I should do it, right? And take their lead. The one downside with just having those soft accommodation requests just with your manager is if your manager changes and you have a new manager come in, that new manager may or may not, A, know that you are receiving accommodations, and B, may not want to play. So if you go to HR and ask for the accommodations request there, it's in your personnel file. So the new manager can't say, no, I'm not going to do it. Well, they've already been put in place and these are the things that I get, right? The other is make sure that the messaging you do with HR, your manager, anybody else, is that it's a clear message. Now, you don't have to say necessarily, well, you will for a formal request. The clear message is, because I have a disability, I work best under these circumstances with this slight change, et cetera, et cetera. The other is to focus on the positive, and that is, I really do well in this environment, right? I really do well when I'm allowed to block off 3 hours a day just to really focus on my work. right? That's another pretty common one, is not to have meetings scheduled throughout the day. So all of this to say, there are different parts of the disclosure, different things to highlight, but it's really important for you to know that you do not need to legally disclose what the disability is if you choose not to. So nobody can say, well, what's your disability? They cannot ask for that unless you're going out on a leave of absence. And then typically a company will have a third-party administrator to handle that. But technically, nobody within your company should have access to your private medical documentation, including what your diagnosis is. Now, you can certainly tell people, that is up to you, but the company cannot force you to tell them what your disability is that is providing the need for your accommodations. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Cool. Any comments on that, Keith?
Yeah, really good. I'd like to sort of deal a little bit more on the last part, the focus on the positive. And I'm thinking of putting it in a way which is like, maybe you should disclose without disclosing. By that I mean, you say, instead of because of a disability I work best with, rather you just say, I work best with, and then you mention whatever you need without actually disclosing that you have a disability. Now, my question about that is, if you do that, does that sort of count in some way as a request for an accommodation,
No.
or is it simply somebody asking for something?
No, it's not. I mean, it's a human workplace, right? For example, you might have a working mom who says, I prefer to come in early, but I have a hard stop at 5 o'clock because I got to pick up my kids, right?
Mhm.
So that's not an accommodation request under ADA. This is how my life works. And this is what I need to really show up and be here, right? And so that, in my mind, should be how all places of business operate,
Mhm.
right? Unfortunately, they don't. But, that's the kind of manager I've always tried to be, is to accommodate based on, what's going to work for the employee, knowing that if I make those very tiny adjustments, that they're bringing their full self to the job and they're loyal to me, right? Because I've said, yes, you can have a life, heaven forbid, right? And I've had plenty of people with disabilities work with me over the years. And, some of them needed like a full hour and a half every single day for a medical reason in the middle of the day. And it's like, if that's what you need, that's what you get. As long as the job's getting done, I don't care. But, again, it really depends on the manager, it depends on the organization. And I do think that when at all possible, to Keith's point, focus on the positive, focus on how you work best. That is the first line of defense, always, always, always. And to try to make it not seem like a demand, but a negotiation. Is it
Mhm.
possible for me not to go to that meeting? Because I never have anything to say anyway. And that's right in the middle of my best work time, right? And I can get a lot more done if I'm not at that meeting. And I can check the minutes of the meeting or talk to, Sharapa later about what happened in the meeting, right? So that's always your first line of defense if you
Yeah.
can. Cool. Good stuff.
One last point on that.
Oh,
Uh,
sure.
yeah, if you say you do this sort of soft sell and it's for a genuine need, what would be if you asked it formally? It would be an accommodation. If you ask them this way and they say yes, great. If they don't grant it and it is a genuine need, I am now asking and do a formal accommodation under the American Disability Act. Okay.
Yes. So that's how you would do it, and it's the manager may not like it, but at the same time, hey, it's sort of what's needed. I know for one case, just really briefly, the person who needed an hour and a half off every day, My manager, I had a new manager come in and I'm like, oh, that person's not here right now. They'll be back later today. Well, why aren't they here? I said, it's a medical appointment and they need to have it every day. And they were like, what? And I'm like, hey, they're one of my top performers. Why would I ever, quibble over this if they're putting the hours in and they're getting the work done? But yeah, people would question me and they were like, well, that requires an accommodations request. I'm like, does it? Really? I mean, we can go through that if you need me to, but that's an awful lot of paperwork just to get to the same place, right? It seems kind of silly. So managers who aren't willing to work with you, that tells you a lot about the manager, is my opinion, right? Yeah. Okay. So
Yeah,
next up, what to disclose?
I don't know if this is a $64 question, but it's a pretty big one. All right. So, what do you need? Understand what the accommodations you need and ask for them. Ask for it in an email, for example, as we were talking about. Describe how you work best. I work best when, or this is how I do well when, things like that. Uh, Two, why you need it. Explain in ordinary, non-clinical terms why it's a hard time processing verbal information, and it helps to have things written down. You know. And an important thing with many of these is that you do not need a formal diagnosis to have that. You just have to have the need voiced to them. And then thirdly, difficulty, more disclosure. The more complicated the request is, the more likely you need formal documentation. For example, if you need a short workday, all of what Jan was just describing likely mean a formal request from the doctor. Uh, One of the things that I want to stress with everyone is this really needs to be what you need as opposed to what you want. It's like the old song, you can't always get what you want, but you always can get what you need. At least under the ADA, that is the case. So if you aren't sure if you absolutely need it, then I would say hold off on it. Unless the environment is very, very supportive and it's likely to be, generous to you and give you some of the things that you may want as well to you. Otherwise, stick to the bare minimum things that you absolutely require to do the job well. Any follow up on that, Jan?
Yeah, so a good point here, it would be the previous example about the person who was highly distracted. So I know, having worked in corporate America for long enough, that managers and facilities get really squeamish about moving people around. It's like, oh my God, it's so much work. You got to pack everything up. So a shortcut to that might be, or if you're in negotiation with your manager, which we're going to talk about next month, about the iterative, interactive process of asking for accommodations. It might be easier just to wear noise canceling headphones or to get those, what the heck do they call them? Those little earlobe thingy mobs that help distract, just to kind of white noise or brown noise it out so you're not as distracted. For people who are visually distracted, which is me, which is why I always sit in a corner, otherwise I'd be staring out the window all the time. Either sitting in a corner, moving your chair around, or getting a carrel, Carrel, like they used to have in the libraries for like little workspaces. So you can get like cardboard, and they're just things that set up on your desk to keep you from seeing everybody who walks by in your periphery, because I'm like a little ADHD squirrel who always has to turn to see who's walking by. So those accommodations might be easier to request. And in fact, you could even purchase them and bring them in yourself and let your manager know why you're doing it rather than changing a cube. So make sure, make sure if you can do something on your own that will work, do it, right? Perfect. And the more difficult the request, the more disclosure. Absolutely. So, when we get into small little nits, like, and a lot of people wear noise canceling headphones at work. I mean, they were kind of all the rage before the pandemic. Nobody thought twice about them, really. So those kind of things are easy to do. The more complicated your request is, the more pushback, number one, and the more disclosure, number two. Right? So that's, if it's easy to do, most companies will comply. If it's harder and if it costs a lot of money, companies are going to have the right to just to say, no, we can't do that. But they're also going to give you more pushback. So it has to be a legitimate cause. One that comes up fairly frequently are people with low vision or hard of hearing. Which, if you're a deaf person and trying to work in an environment, a corporate environment, and you don't read lips and you need to attend meetings or whatnot, one of the common accommodations would be to have somebody sign, but that costs a lot of money. And that's difficult. So somebody who is slightly hard of hearing, like myself, wouldn't be able to make a good case to get somebody who signed, even if I read sign language, right? So you have to be careful what you're asking for, and you have to have a good cause. And again, the more difficult the accommodation, the more you're going to have to disclose. Really good
Thank you.
stuff. Yeah. Whoops.
Gonna put you on. Wait, there's more.
But wait,
Uh,
go ahead.
if I can, I can follow up with another thing on
Yeah.
the last section. Putting you on the hot seat here. Can you recall a particular difficult situation or complicated situation which involved neurodiversity that you'd like to bring up?
So I'm trying to think of which one, right? I mean, there's been several. I think one of the hardest ones that I've seen recently was a formal request to provide training to an entire department on neurodivergency. And
Yeah,
I'm not saying it wasn't needed, because
yeah.
I think it is. But that, because it stretched beyond the individual and included the whole darn department, that
Mhm,
starts being more difficult to put in place,
mhm,
right? And yeah, so that one was tough. I've also seen, some other people frankly asking for accommodations they're never going to get.
mhm,
And remember, accommodations really are only good if you can do the core requirements of the job. You still have to be able to do the core requirements of the job. So it wouldn't fly if you were a cashier working at Chili's and your accommodation request was, I can't deal with the public. I can't have interaction with the public, because that's
yeah,
your job, right?
yeah.
So you have to be a little bit careful. Now, what I have also seen is people who work at a place like Chili's or Safeway or some other type of retail, and they've started in a position that was not customer facing. And over a period of time, their jobs stretched a little bit, so they became more customer facing. And they could do short bits of it, but then it's like, well, we're going to put you on the register full time because you're really good at it. And it's like, yeah, but I can't manage dealing with the public for a straight 8 hours. That's too much for me. And it's like,
Yeah.
oh, and that gets into but you did okay for an hour here and an hour there. And so that's difficult, because the job you were hired for is not the job you're now being asked to do. Right. And that can be a little tricky, because you're asking to kind of step down or step away from the job that you've been asked to do. I went to a meeting, oh gosh, over a decade ago, over at Facebook, and that bastion of humanity. Anyway,
But there,
the individual had bipolar, and he was a program manager or something. I forget what it was, but he suddenly, out of the blue, had been put on an on-call rotation, so that he had to be available 24 hours a day for 1 week out of like 20 or something. And because of his symptomology with his bipolar, he could not be awake more than 20 hours at a stretch, or he would start to hallucinate and become psychotic. And he needed his sleep. And so he described the process of how he had to ask for a formal accommodation because his job had changed, right? That was never required before. And it was interesting because he's like, oh, yeah, and Facebook did a really good job. Well, it took 4 months for the accommodation to go through. And I'm like, God, this poor dude. I don't know how, I don't think I'd be applauding that, but hey, so yeah, so we do see this, fairly common and commonly. And I think, that certainly before you ask for accommodations, talk to somebody, do your research, really understand what is the impact on the company. Does it cost them anything? Is it hard to do? Because it is a bit of a dance. There's no doubt about it. You're kind of going back and forth with the company, with the manager to see if you can come up with a happy medium. So that's all we had on our first cut. Next month, we're going to dig a little deeper. That is sort of like the general advice about disclosure. Next month, we're going to talk about the underlying law that protects disclosure and why you would do it. So we're going to talk about ADA. We're going to talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act that was signed into law in 1974 by a Republican president, I might add. We're going to talk about what its protections are, how it's supposed to work, right, in an ideal world. And for anybody who's lived to the age of 22 or longer, you know that how things are supposed to work and how they actually work, yeah, there might be a little discrepancy. So we're going to talk about that too. One of the things that I want to bring up, which I would not have brought up 6 months ago, is doxing. So one of the organizations that I work with has federal contracts, and their concern today, as of now, is they're concerned that in order to maintain those federal contracts, they may need to disclose information about their employees, including disabilities. So that worries me, certainly worries them. Because that is not information anybody wants to share, right? And right now, under the law, they can't share that. However, given the way certain things seem to look, will that information be accessible to someone at Doge? Or will that information be required to be submitted to receive federal funding? I don't know. So that's a big question mark in my mind. What are the recourses? So let's say you've gone through the process and your accommodations were denied. Do you have a legal leg to stand on? What can you do, right? How do you keep the channels of communication open? Or if you need to take legal action, how would you go about doing that? And then the last is all this worth it? I think again, it really does depend on who you are, what you need, the company, your job, so many other things. But I think for most of us, we want to be authentic in the workplace. I mean, that is an important aspect because we spend so much time at work that it's kind of unfortunate to think about, I can't even tell people. In many ways, it's like the LGBTQIA back 30, 40 years ago. I mean, I'm old enough to have worked with people who were gay and lesbian who did not come out. They were afraid to let their coworkers know. And I can't even imagine that now, right? Because that is having to put on such a huge mask. So in my mind and in my world, I want everybody to be who they are. I think that's really important, but I realize that I'm unusual. So we'll talk a little bit about, is this whole thing worth it? And that's all we got today, except to say, for those of you who wish to pay for coffee for Keith and I, um, we are accepting payments of any sort. If you choose to, you certainly don't have to. But I was admonished by one of my employees that we should have this up on the slide deck. So here it is. Anyway, any questions? Oh, before we go on, asking for accommodations, the law versus practicality. So we're going to go into it. April 16th, managing workplace communications, and so on and so forth through the year. In the meantime, does anybody have any questions, anything they want to bring up, any concerns? Shoot it out.
Are you awake?
Yeah,
Are you alive?
we put you all to sleep. I hope we didn't.
Yeah.
Well, I will let you all go so that I can call my mother, my 99-year-old mother, and find out who's trying to bamboozle her out of $10,000. Ah, there we go, Ben. About disclosing during the interview. So, it so depends, Ben. Our general advice has been, if you feel that people are going to think that there's something different about you during the interview process, then I would say disclose. Again, to what Keith was saying earlier, if you have difficulty making eye contact, which in Western civilization is conflated to mean you're not trustworthy. It's ridiculous. If you struggle to answer a question, if you have high anxiety, then all of that, I think, when the interview is set up, you should tell the scheduler, by the way, I tend to get anxious during interviews, and I'm wondering if it'd be okay. Can I possibly get some of the questions in advance so I can kind of front load the questions that I'll be asked to answer? Or you could also say, I really have a hard time answering questions while somebody's watching me. What's really useful, I found, is I'm happy to log in and say hi to the manager. But once we get into heavy duty questions, I like to be able to turn my camera off because it's easier for me to answer questions when I know somebody's not watching me, right? So those are some of the finer points. In an ideal world, everybody should be able to disclose this stuff during the interview process or when applying for the job. But again, it really depends. It depends on the company, depends on who you're interviewing with. The other thing is, I think that it depends on who the interview is with. If you're having a screener call with somebody out of HR, don't bother, because all they want is basic information of whether or not you're living and breathing and you have the requisite skills. If you're having a second round interview with a manager or a high level coworker, that might be a time to disclose. But again, I have no problem with people disclosing or asking for accommodations. I don't even know if I would disclose. I would just ask for, hey, can I turn my camera off after I say hi to everybody? Keith, what do you think about that?
I think that makes a lot of sense. And sometimes you're seeing where even the interviewers keep the camera off. So it's like, well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So you say, hey, let's do it like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it really, yeah. And Faith, your question regarding have a third party advocate involved with disclosure. So I will say that most hiring managers and companies get really nervous when there's a third party there in the interview process. I think it's absolutely wonderful to have a coach or somebody you're working with who can run you through the questions, who can, work with you on your interviewing technique and your skills. to help you, write up some accommodations, that's a great use of a coach or an advocate. But to bring somebody in, I know for me, I've participated in interviews, again, mostly in neurodivergent hiring programs. And it always made the manager so nervous that I always wondered if it was really worth it. Hopefully that answers your question. And I will say, not you, but some of the other clients we've worked with, who may have overbearing parents. And I've told them, look, you're not going to be able to attend the interview with your kid. And they look at me like, I'm not. It's like, well, unless you're planning on showing up and doing the work for your kid, I really don't think that that's appropriate. So that's a little bit of a fine line. It really just depends. Good questions. Anything else? Again, thank you all so very much for attending today. Really appreciate it. Please come next time because that will be more of the guts of ADA. And this recording will be up on our website and probably in about a week. It depends on how long it takes us to get it up because they're really big files. But I really appreciate everybody for coming today. Thank you so very much.
Yes, thank you all.
Yes, indeed. All righty.
Okay. Hey,
Take care.